Bob Ross, this was early in the morning, called and said, we need to be on the air, full power, for the 6 o'clock news for WCBS. And I said, well, I don't know how I'm going to get it there, but they're letting private fly. And Bob said, get a plane and take that, buy it a seat.
September 11, 2001 is remembered for its profound human tragedy, but behind the scenes, it also presented an unthinkable challenge for broadcasters. How do you get back on the air when your transmitter site no longer exists? At the time, many of New York City's major TV and radio signals originated from the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which in an instant was gone. The result? A broadcast blackout for the estimated 20% of the region that wasn't connected to cable or satellite, and instead relied on over-the-air signals through rabbit ear antennas. Cable and satellite systems weren't spared either. Many providers depended on over-the-air signals from broadcasters rather than direct fiber connections. In the chaotic days after 9/11, some stations scrambled to restore temporary signals from the Empire State Building. But for the long-term solution, a new hub emerged, the Armstrong Tower in Alpine, New Jersey, the birthplace of FM radio. Join me as we explore the technical, logistical, and equipment challenges of getting New York's broadcasters back online after one of the darkest days in modern history. This is Inside the Broadcast, 9/12, back on the air.
I can't believe how strong this wind is.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world.
And now welcome inside the broadcast, everybody.
Hello friends, welcome inside the broadcast. This is episode 2 of our series 9/12, back on the air. Today we'll be speaking to the recently retired Joe Mack of the former Harris Corporation, now known as Gates Air. The aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy actually saw Joe travel to New York City, where he was able to help broadcasters from the ground. One of those broadcasters was WCBS, who had a backup transmitter on the Empire State Building, but it needed a little love. He and his company also assisted with the equipment needs of those at Armstrong Tower in Alpine, New Jersey. Our conversation begins with Joe explaining his job duties at the time of 9/11.
So at the time of 9/11, I worked for Harris Corporation and I worked for the broadcast division. I was the vice president of strategic or national accounts, working in Cincinnati, and took care of pretty much all of the major accounts in New York City, LA, Dallas, Chicago, the major broadcasters.
If it's possible, take us through the impact that 9/11 had on equipment manufacturing and also how it changed the priorities of what equipment was being distributed and when.
The morning of 9/11, I was sitting in my office and I got a call from a gentleman that lived in New Hampshire that worked for us and said, hey, Joe, did you see it looked like a small plane had flown into one of the towers? And I said, no, but let me go into the conference room and turn on the television to one of the networks and see what's going on. So we saw it and it looked bad. And we were in there, whatever the duration was between the second plane, and we watched the second plane hit the tower. And we all knew that things had changed and didn't even consider either one of the towers coming down at that point in time. And we thought, wow, what are we going to do? These guys are going to need some help up there on the North Tower. We got on the phone to our manufacturing facility in Quincy, Illinois. Quincy is where Gates Air now, has a very large manufacturing facility. And we said, hey, we should be prepared if something happens here, if they need anything, meaning any of the broadcasters in New York. So we got everybody on a call and said, let's just hold up and see what's going on. And then the next thing that happened were the towers came down. And there was quite a little bit of time between that, as you know. And at that point in time, we had received calls from Andy Bader at Tribune, Bob Ross, Paul Puccio, Bob Seidel, Greg Cope at CBS. We received calls from NBC and Al Resnick from ABC that said, hey, but actually that happened before this. If anything happens to the towers, come help us. And we said, okay. And then the towers came down, and the first thing we'll talk about is NBC. We had at that time, a Channel 4 full transmitter just coming off a test for Cordillera Broadcasting. And Andy Sook was either the president or vice president of engineering for Cordillera. And we called Andy and said, Andy, NBC may need this transmitter. And September, and if you're going to put something out in Montana, Idaho, somewhere in North Dakota, you only got a finite amount of time to get it in. And you're in September, so we couldn't make one for him in less than 120 days. So we'd be into winter by then. And Andy, being the class act that he's always been, said, if you need that transmitter, you take it. So that was that. And that's only one of many that come to mind, but that was a full transmitter. We had, it was pretty much anything we had in production became available. Then we had a very small transmitter for ABC, which we had just out of production, that obviously they took right away. We had parts and pieces for, at that time, Tribune in New York City, and there were half a dozen others, obviously, that we helped out with small, low power transmitters. But the thing was to find a place to put everything, and it was Alpine Tower. So I want to come back to CBS after this, but we started to put things together in Quincy and called in the people that we knew from our installation teams that were across the United States to go into New York City when needed, if needed, and how we get them there. But the real key to that was, before going to Alpine Tower, CBS had an old transmitter of ours. I'll bet it was 30 plus years old, up on the top of Empire State. And it had, the story goes, and I don't know the truth to this, but the story goes, the gentleman that was supposed to get rid of that lease had forgotten to sign the lease, or forgot to terminate the lease to the Empire State Building. And he became a hero at that moment in time because the transmitter was still up there. But unfortunately, the transmitter had not had a lot of tender loving care or exercise. And what had happened there is Bob Seidel and Greg Copa and Paul Puccio went up there to fire it up and got it fired up. And we also had another small little 1,000 watt transmitter up there that I think Marty Fauble from Hearst called it a peanut whistle because it was so small. But and by the way, the people from Hearst were outstanding. They said they didn't have any stations that were affected by that, but they said anything that we have in production, and Gray Television said the same thing, just take it. But coming back to that, it was an interesting situation that they finally got it up and running and started to have some issues with it. And this had gone on about a week, and the debris cloud, if you remember, there was a debris cloud that came over and clogged up all of our old fan blades and filters that hadn't been worked on in quite a while. So Bob Seidel and Copa and Paul Puccio went up and just babied it. And then it got to a point where they really needed some help. So we had a crew down in Dallas as soon as we thought that it was a possibility that they needed real help for this transmitter. Now, you would think any of our people could work on it. Well, this is a 30-year-old transmitter that long ago. So we had to find the right people throughout our teams, installation teams, and John Howell, who was in charge of our installation, and Tony really did a heroic job and found the right people for the right positions to go fix things. And the group out of Texas drove up because you couldn't fly.
Wow.
Right? You could fly private, and then we'll get into that again here in a moment. But they drove up and started to work on the transmitter. And then because the government said, get that transmitter back on the air because it truly is the only thing that's showing anything. And we did, but there was an issue with something called a finger stock. Now, these television transmitters, or this single television transmitter that was up on Empire, which has been replaced, has two tubes in it, two very large tubes, tubes about the size of a small cooler. And it's an interesting technology that we've used for 50, 60, 70, 100 years. But there's only a few people left that know how to work on them. So they came up, worked on them, and the finger stock actually arced and sparked. So we had the raw material back at the factory in Quincy to remanufacture the finger stock to get this transmitter back up to full power, because when the finger stock failed, it took it down to a much lower power output. But Bob Ross, God rest his soul, who was the boss of CBS on the East Coast for engineering and operations, called and said, this was early in the morning, called and said, we need to be on the air full power for the 6 o'clock news for WCBS. And I said, well, I don't know how I'm going to get it there. But they're letting private fly. And Bob said, get a plane and take that, buy it a seat. Well, we bought the plane, but we had the plane come in from St. Louis to Quincy and handed a box no bigger than 2 foot square onto the airplane and went to Teterboro with it, which is just outside of New York City, because you couldn't fly into LaGuardia, or you couldn't fly into Kennedy. That was just shut down. At least that's what I was told. So we went in, and there was nobody on the plane but the box. We didn't put anybody on with it because we already had people on the ground there. And we had all kinds of trouble getting it into the city across the, I don't know if it was across the George Washington or through the Lincoln Tunnel, or I don't know how. Well, there was an issue getting it onto Manhattan, but they finally worked through that. It wasn't through FEMA. I don't know who it was through, but they got us onto Manhattan, and they got it taken down to the Empire State Building on a courier. Now, I don't know if it was a bicycle or if it was a taxi, but we got it there. And with the help of CBS, this isn't a heroic thing for Harris/Gates Air. This includes everybody and anybody that helped, and everybody did. It's a really small knit industry. But we got the finger stock there, put it in with their help, and it came up perfectly. And we were a minute and a half or 2 minutes late, but we got it on for what they needed to get on. And then we stayed and babysat that thing for a couple of more weeks. And then CBS flew a gentleman up. And I don't know how he got up there. Maybe he drove from their Dallas station, who was really into older tube transmitters. And he just lived there for months. And when that transmitter was done and we got Alpine going with everybody, that transmitter was as good as brand new for being 30 plus years old, because they had to, right? They had to make it. They had to make it right. But then going over to the Alpine side, it was a bit crazy because things were happening so quickly, and everybody wanted to make sure that the tower was stable and everything was good, and everything turned out very well. But people were shipping things in from all over the world if they could get it there and how they could get it there. But one thing that was interesting from a Harris Gates Air side was we were told at that time by our chairman down in Melbourne, Florida, for Harris, that if anything, if a customer needed something, do not wait on the formalization of paperwork. If a broadcaster needs this now, no, we don't need a PO. We need a verbal and something to follow up. We'll send them the paperwork. They can get it signed. But there was never, ever a holdup if a customer needed something, whether it was just parts, even for somebody else's transmitter or somebody else's antenna. If we had the parts in our facility and they needed it, we would send it. And, I can honestly say, out of the tens of millions of dollars of stuff that we had out there without the proper paperwork, not one exception was taken. Not one. Everything was done. It was something that will only happen once in a lifetime, that everybody worked so well together. And then there was another interesting caveat that I don't think many people know about, is that since Channel 2 was up, obviously it's not Channel 2 because of the DTV conversion, but WCBS said, Bob Ross called me and said, Joe, I want to put up all of the digital subcarriers on our digital side from the Empire State Building. And I said, okay, so people could watch that over the air. And I said, well, what are you going to put on it so we can send you the right things? He said, I've offered it to all the other networks to get them up on the air. If any network or any non-network wanted to get on locally, so we sent him all of the cards for his encoders that we manufactured. It was called a Flexicoder at the time, to make sure that he had as many channels as the chassis would hold to allow to do that. Now, I don't know if anybody did or not, but I know that he had all the equipment to do that. And what our goal was very simple. If somebody was off the air and needed to get on the air, no matter if they were a customer of ours in the past or not, was to help in any way possible, and to provide labor, material, and transmitters if we could.
Everything related to getting this WCBS transmitter up and running is nothing short of fascinating to me. The
Well,
logistics.
but wait, it was running. It had run since they hit the on button. We were just trying to make it reliable and to be on long term, because it didn't mind being on a day or two at a time, but to be called into full-time service was a different story.
You also touched on Hearst Broadcasting and Gray Television sort of allowing others to take their place in line as far as new transmitters were concerned, or new parts or pieces of equipment. Just speak to that sort of camaraderie of the broadcasting industry at this time period as a whole, if you can.
Well, I must say, though, it's not. This was just exemplary for our industry, that everybody understood what had to happen, and for the good of our public and viewers to get things back up on the air. But even before 9/11, if one of the broadcasters, even in the same market, a competitor would burn a hole in a piece of waveguide, or a piece of a stick of rigid on a tower, and if the neighbor, station one and station two, they were competitors, and station two had a problem and station one had a part, they'd help them get back on the air. That, I mean, yes, it was extraordinary, but our industry in those days, it was also extraordinary, and people helped each other.
Many of the stations were moving to Alpine Tower after 9/11. Can you just take me through what that process was like from an equipment manufacturing standpoint? Because obviously, you have a bunch of stations that are trying to move there at the same time, and there had to be a deluge of requests. What was necessary on your end to actually keep up with those requests?
Well, if we had it in manufacturing, for us, it was very simple. If there was a need, we'd fill it, and that was our mantra for the 43 years I was with the company. Um, it just take care of the customer, just that simple. And to say that, yeah, we put people in trucks, but it was more than just us. First thing that had to happen at Alpine, and by the way, our CFO at the time and myself got in my Acura, and we drove in 3 days after they came down because we wanted to make sure that when our equipment got there, that everything was fine, or if something was broken, that nobody had any issues with it. So we were there on the ground. I've got all kinds of memories of that. That's crazy. But the thing that Alpine first of all had to do was figure out where the power was coming from, because these television transmitters take a lot of electricity. And uh, Andy Bader from Tribune and Paul Puccio from CBS, Bob Seidel from CBS, Al Resnick, ABC, and the list goes on. I don't know where, I don't know if it was General Electric power generation or who the vendors were that supplied it. But when we got there, there were tractor trailers that, when you lease electricity for an outdoor concert, you see the tractor trailers show up. There were, man, along the north side of Armstrong Tower, there were, I'll bet there were 6 or 7 of them. And everybody was working like crazy to get main power brought into the building and what rooms they were going to go in at the base of Alpine Tower. And then there were tower crews getting ready to go and up on the tower, and Dielectric and ERI and that whole group just did amazing. Those are the major antenna manufacturers that just did amazing work. And then Andrew with Line, and I mean, it was, and I if I didn't mention somebody that I should have, I apologize, but everybody was working crazy. Honestly, once we got into Alpine, they said, "Here's where your transmitter's going. Here's the rooms that they're going in," uh, and you had to make sure you had enough air conditioning as well. So there were air conditioning units through windows, and the stuff that you would use at a like a big event venue in a tent, that were pumped into the transmitter rooms. And but I hate to say it, but our job was easy compared to what some of these other guys had to do. Our biggest issue was the stuff that we do, the things that we manufacture, aren't put on the shelf and at that time waiting for a customer. They're very, very specific, designed television transmitters with a very specific frequency and to meet all the FCC criteria and to pass an FCC proof. But the one thing, speaking of the FCC, the one thing that the FCC did for us was said, get them on the air. Do it right, but get them on the air. So a lot of that paperwork was not necessary until afterwards, when you got them on the air, and then you could go back and clean it up to make sure everything was working just perfectly. But one of the things that was a problem, I think, with Alpine is you were so far up on the Jersey Palisades that it was quite a distance from Manhattan, and we weren't. I mean, when I say we, the group that was out there, I mean the tower guys were trying to aim into the populace with the antennas, and we were trying to get as much power. And I have to tell you that Comarch, they were sending transmitters. I don't know if Rhodey sent any transmitters or not. I know Larkan at that time, they were, I don't know if they were still doing that or not, but it was everybody. I mean, it just wasn't, Harris Gates Air, but we'd like to think that we had the majority just because that's who we were and who we are. Um, it was an interesting time, that's for certain. And the only thing you could, when the towers came down, the only way we could get into talking to our people on on Manhattan was cell phones, because the exchanges were down. Local exchanges were down through that ran through the bottom of New York, or Manhattan, I should say. So it was tough. But the smell of the debris cloud was something I'll never forget. That's an interesting thing.
Just following up on that, on a personal note, explain what it was like, going into Manhattan after this happened. Just, this national tragedy has occurred here. And obviously, you would have known some people that maybe were casualties or were affected by it at the least. And I'm just kind of curious of your takeaway from that whole thing.
Well, we did know some of our friends. Well, some of our friends passed away, for certain. But we came across the New Jersey Turnpike and came in across the GW, because we thought that would be the easiest thing, to stay far enough uptown from the towers, and you could see the smoke from miles and miles away. And then you'd look over by Newark, by the airport, and you wouldn't see the towers, and that was an interesting scenario. And then we kind of came down in and got into Manhattan, which was it was interesting because there wasn't a whole lot of anything moving around. And we stayed at the Sheraton Times Square, which is just about far enough away, but close enough to all of the broadcasters that we were dealing with in case we had to go into their offices or do anything like that. And it was far enough up where you could get across the bridge and go up to Alpine Tower. But we spent a lot of time up on the Empire State Building with the CBS people, simply for the fact that transmitter had to stay in the air. It's not that I could fix it, but at least they had a throat to choke, and in case something went wrong, or I could make the right calls to Quincy and say, "Hey, man, figure this out," right? And
Right.
fortunately, that was not the case. But we we actually were up on the top of Empire, and probably shouldn't say this, but went out on the first mezzanine, where the transmitter was. There's a big window where there was a microwave receiver for the transmitter sitting, and went outside and looked down to Lower Manhattan, and the buildings are gone, and then that's where you could smell the debris cloud. And it's not like when I say debris cloud, there was just a stench. There was a cloud that everybody talked about that I didn't necessarily ever see, something specific like that, but it stunk bad. And the one thing I really do remember personally was we went to the bar at the Sheraton to get a beer and go to bed, and there were four firefighters in there from some other state, to be honest with you, and they looked weary, and we bought them a beer and said thank you and went to bed. And I thought to myself, boy, how lucky are we? That's something. And then we stayed for a couple of weeks. I think we stayed 7, 8 days, and made sure things were fine, and got the right people on the ground from our company. How do I say it? With the ability that our company gave us, and we're thankful for that, to get things done. Harris and Gates Air really allowed us to do what we needed to do to help the industry, and I'm sure Comark did the same thing, and the other manufacturers. But I can just talk from ours that we were told, don't leave one screw unturned, or let one problem unsolved, and that was the mentality of Gates Air and Harris Corporation.
It sounds like you guys and everyone involved was just so thorough in handling all of this equipment. When I spoke to Andy Bader, he mentioned you and your trek to New York City as unbelievably good support. And I was just curious what it was like working with Andy Bader and the other engineers who were involved in this transition.
The one thing that I do have to say is Andy was really the unsung hero here. Now, this is just my opinion, and he is still a very good friend of mine. Uh, Andy hosted a call daily with every manufacturer, with every broadcaster that needed help, and we went over item by item on who was supplying what to when and to why every day and where it was in conjunction to fulfillment. And he managed it like a sergeant would or like a drill instructor would. It was unbelievable. And a lot of the success was due to Andy. And I do have to say that the CBS boys had a lot of organization, and that was, I mean, Andy took care of everybody. CBS was trying to keep everybody on the air with one transmitter. Uh, Ross, Seidel, Puccio, and Copa. Those were the four major players for CBS, and then Andy. And by the way, Ross and Puccio were on the Andy call too. I mean, it was Andy really, really rocked. He's an unsung hero. If anybody's an unsung hero, it's all the engineers. It is. It's not us. It's not the suppliers. It's everybody that worked crazy to get it done and the people that organized it.
I appreciate you touching on that. As always, the camaraderie in this industry fascinates me, and I love to see it. Lastly, I'd just be curious, is there anything else you wanted to add about your interactions with the FCC during this process?
What we manufacture is all FCC approved and type accepted. It was after everything got on the air and the paperwork needed to be done that the individual stations and groups and attorneys got together to get the FCC what they really needed for, temporary permits for Alpine. I can't imagine it. Think about this. No permits for power, no permits for tower work, no permits for anything. It was get it on the air. And that's what happened. That is absolutely what happened, and safely, might I add.
That was our conversation with Joe Mack of the Harris Corporation, now known as Gates Air. Just a fascinating look at the effort and teamwork that went into getting all of these stations back on the air. In our next and last episode of this series, we'll speak to Charles Sackerman, who oversees Armstrong Tower. He speaks about the infrastructure changes needed for Armstrong Tower to be able to host all of these broadcasters. This series was dedicated to Rod Coppola, Don DeFranco, Steve Jacobson, Robert Pattison, Isaias Rivera, and Bill Steckman. All were broadcast engineers who lost their lives at the World Trade Center on 9/11. May they rest in peace, and may their memories be a blessing.